You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. In the quest to emulate classic European beer styles as closely as possible, many brewers prefer to source their ingredients from the region where the style was developed, believing it has a noticeable impact on the quality of their beer. While unquestionably necessary in some cases, like the type of yeast used for Belgian ale, other ingredients are viewed by some as not having as strong of an impact. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to discuss the use of Czech Pilsner Malt when making Czech Pale Lager.
Marshall, I think that's one thing that you and me hold in common is that we both love Czech Pale Lager.
Oh, yeah.
And when you think about the style, how is this any different than a German lager, right? Like Pilsner malt, noble hops, clean fermenting lager yeast. And in my opinion, the Czech malt, maltsters of the world really is one of the ingredients that helps them differentiate themselves from other European lagers.
Well, yeah, and the history, we talked a little bit about it, I believe it was last week's episode about the history of Pilsner Malt. We'll get a little bit into that into this episode as well, but it really did sort of originate in the Czech Republic, and so it makes sense that people would focus on that ingredient when making Czech styles of beer, particularly lager beers. Now, over hundreds of batches of beer that I've brewed, I've used malts from all of the main brewing regions, at least the ones that I can think of. And it was admittedly motivated by my belief that doing so would have some sort of a positive qualitative impact on the beers I was brewing and make them taste, a little more like you might expect if you were drinking a beer in that specific region. Well, many years back, I bought a sack of Weiermann floor malted Pilsner malt, which was nearly double the cost of the way cheaper domestic Pilsner malt that I had been using. And I only got it because someone told me it would make a better beer, and I wonder now, did it really do that? I didn't compare them side by side, but I still wonder if it had that big of an impact. I'm looking forward to chatting with you about this topic, Jordan, as well as an experiment that you did comparing Czech Pilsner Malt to a US-made version in a Czech Pale Lager. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, September of 2024, Brewlosophy contributor, the Brew Club leadership member, and regular co-host of this show, Will Lovell, will be taking the stage yet again to answer patron questions. I believe the last time he did this Q&A was over a year ago. So, it's about time for his return. And I would strongly recommend anyone who attends to ask him about more than just beer. He has his hands in all sorts of other cool hobbies that he would love to chat with you all about. To be a part of this session, be sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Saturday, September 21st, 2024, as Will's going to be taking questions on Sunday, the 22nd. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook and Patreon pages, so you can go back and listen or watch them whenever you like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Finally, if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allow you to leave those ratings and reviews, we would appreciate that immensely, as it helps those who have yet to hear of this show to more easily find it. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches. I've also used their 240-volt system for 10-gallon batches, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. If you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag home brewing starter kits. If you've been considering going electric, though, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Ryan Bailey had some feedback after listening to episode 329, where our focus was on hop water, namely the amount of time hops stay in contact with the water. Ryan said, I recently bought my first Keezer, but since I didn't have anything brewed and ready to keg, the first thing I put on tap was hop water, and I've been keeping a keg on tap all of the time since. I've tried a few different methods, and I've decided I'm just going to stick with the simplest method of tossing my minerals and some metabisulfite into the water with a sleeve of hops and letting them stay in. Other than the first and last pint, which both end up with some sediment, I haven't noticed any of the excessive bitterness that Will mentioned with this method. Of course, my favorite commercial version is Sierra Nevada's, which I think is the piniest version, so maybe it just works with my taste preferences. Either way, I can burst carbonate and be drinking it within a day or so, which beats waiting to pull the hops out. On a related note, I also kept hearing people saying to put yeast in your hop water, so I gave that a try on one batch. I didn't notice much in the way of more fruity hop flavors, but I did learn what diacetyl tastes like. I'm going back to the no yeast method for all future batches. Jordan, I know you have experience with both, duration of, I guess, dry hopping hop water, as well as the yeast thing. What say you about Ryan's feedback?
Well, you definitely don't want diacetyl in your hop water, so that's an unfortunate outcome. And it's funny. I once did a one with lager yeast, and I did it cold, like 40 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that, and it was a sulfur bomb. So I think that there is some, definitely can use yeast successfully, and maybe ALDC could be our friend, which is such a wild idea to use that in the hop water.
Yeah.
But I think the big thing is just keeping oxygen out. As we saw in my experiment, the non-yeasted batch seemed to get quite oxidized, and I've seen people post online referencing that article saying they've had the same problem. So as long as you can keep oxygen out, maybe yeast isn't absolutely necessary. I was actually lucky enough to try Will's hop waters side by side when I was visiting in San Antonio, and I didn't do a triangle test, but in side by side I did correctly guess which one I thought was which, and I thought the longer stored one had a little bit of a sharper flavor, but by no means was it gross or bad. It was just a little different. So I love this idea of just keeping it in, with hop water. If we can make this thing as easy as possible, I think that's going to be ideal, right? Because it's just water and hops. Do we really have to go through an entire brew day on this thing? So if that method's working, I love this idea.
That's exactly it. I've actually heard from quite a few folks since we dropped that episode, and it seems like Ryan's approach is the most common. Not only do people tend to leave the hops in the keg the whole time, probably, like you said, Jordan, because it's just so much easier to do it that way, but nobody I've heard from does the yeast thing. I know that we tested that out. In fact, I think it was one of your experiments, Jordan, and it did, like you said, it did have that, seemed to have like an oxidative effect, the water that didn't get the yeast. So my assumption, we talked about this internally, but my assumption is that the oxidation is largely a function of the hops. And that's why we see such quick, oxidizing effects with hazy IPA, which are heavily hopped, particularly dry hopped. So maybe, if you struggle to keep oxygen out of your water, which just sounds wild to me, and you're getting this kind of oxidation type of reaction, then maybe it would be good to utilize approaches that minimize, cold side oxidation, or, throw a little bit of yeast in there. But like I said, from what I've heard from our readers, our listeners, and the like, they are doing almost exactly what it sounds like Ryan is doing. And, they're reaching out to me saying, do I really need to put yeast in my water? I don't think so. The number one way to tell is if you like the product that you're making and it's not turning colors or anything like that, then you're probably doing just fine. For some people, maybe there is, that could be a method that would be helpful for them. But thank you so much for the feedback, Ryan, and congratulations on the new Keezer. That's always a fun build. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. All right, for those of you who haven't already, please go subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brewlosophy Show with no umlaut. I think we're upwards of 25,000 subscribers already in the first year and a half. And that's all, we got to give Martin all the credit for that. He's been hard at work creating some really rad brewing content that we are absolutely confident you're going to love just as much as this show. Alrighty, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on using Czech Pilsner Malt when making Czech Pale Lager. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Level up your brewing game with one of the coolest brewing gadgets on the market today, the Easy Dens and Smart Rev Combo by Anton Parr. These smart tools provide precise gravity measurements and fermentation tracking with minimal sample volume, and it's all synced to your smartphone via the Brewmeister app. Brewlosophy's Martin Keen loves using the Easy Dens as it makes precise measurements high-tech, hassle-free, and honestly really cool. Visit EasyDens.com today and use code BREW15 for 15% off. That's BRU15 to get 15% off your order.
After investing billions to light up our network, T-Mobile is America's largest 5G network. Plus, right now, you can switch, keep your phone, and we'll pay it off up to $800. See how you can save on every plan versus Verizon and AT&T at T-Mobile.com/across America.
Up to 4 lines via virtual prepaid card. Allow 15 days. Qualifying unlocked device credit service ported 90+ days with device and eligible carrier and timely redemption required. Card has no cash access and expires in 6 months.
After water, malt is the second most prominent ingredient used to make beer, so it makes sense brewers would pay special attention to it, especially when making styles that are notably more malt forward and viewed as being delicately flavored. A widely held belief among brewers is that best versions of regionally distinct beers, such as Czech Pale Lager, are best when made with malt that's grown and malted in the same region. And that's for various reasons. Let's start off, before getting into those reasons, by going over some basics of malt.
Right. And so, there's a lot of different varieties of malt, and it could be the, grain that's used, like malted wheat or malted barley. But even within the barley plant, there are various types of barley. And so what we commonly think about when it comes to the different types is 2-row barley or 6-row. And that 2-row has 2 kernels along the barley's head, while 6-row has more like 6 consecutively along the head. And that's why they call it that. But even within that, there's different varieties, right? There's, I don't remember the names anymore, but there's like within 2-row, there's several different varieties. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I didn't want to go into all of the different names of the barley varieties, but that is a factor that's going to play into the people's belief that, one region's type of Pilsner malt, for example, is going to be better than another. Now, obviously preference is subjective. We say that a million times every episode, I feel. So, we can't say, I think we can't paint with too broad of a brush when it comes to which is better. What we like to speak in terms of is there a difference? Is there a perceptible difference between them? And there are, like you said, Jordan, there are a lot of different barley varieties out there. If you take the umbrella of 2-row barley varieties that are used for brewing, I think there's like 16 or 17 that are more commonly used than others, but there's way more than that even that are out there and can be used just as well. And so that can contribute, understandably, right, to aroma and flavor and even mouthfeel differences in that barley. Again, we're not going to dig too deep into the names of those, but just to understand that these different varieties are believed to have different, flavor perceptible characteristics, to say the least. Right.
And so there's both the grain, strain type. I think like Lightning might be one. And, Cade's done a lot of work at OSU looking at these different varieties. But then there's also how the production methods, right?
Yes.
And so that's where we get things like Pilsner malt relative to pale malt, relative to like caramel malt or something like that. And then there's others where it's more confounded, like Maris Otter, where it's both the production method and the grain variety. And I think that that's really a good a point to make is that's exactly what Czech malt is it's both the region in which it's grown, which there might be some sort of terroir effect, the types of strains that are grown, as well as the production method. And so ultimately, people are saying that this Pilsner malt that comes out of Czech is different. But maybe more just broadly speaking, ostensibly, two-row is purportedly a quote cleaner with more bready and toasty flavor compared to those more grainy and earthy notes from a 6-row barley. So you can see that in theory, there is a lot of difference, even though these various malts really look the same to the naked eye.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I, we'll talk a little bit more about what the purported differences are later, but just, you think about the barley variety, terroir, which is commonly talked about with things like wine grapes and such. And I think most people accept that, terroir has has an impact on the flavor of what's grown there. And so these are the things that are in mind. And then to round that off, like you said, the malting practices and the way these malts are produced. Now, like I mentioned, just recently in a recent episode, we talked a little bit about the history of Pilsner malt. I love history, so I'm going to go over real briefly some of that stuff again. In the early 19th century, Joseph Groll, a brewer from the Bavarian region of Germany, was actually brought over to Pilsen in the Czech Republic to be the head brewer of a new brewery there. And the townspeople brought this guy over from Bavaria because of how horrible their beer was at the time. They were so sick of bad beer that they were actually pouring it out in the streets and banded together to build this new brewery, which again was headed by Joseph Groll. If that name sounds familiar, if you've ever had, it's a very familiar name in Pilsner brewing anyways. I'm sure you've heard it before. He was very familiar. This Joseph guy was very familiar with the malting practices being employed in England at the time that allowed for kilning with indirect heat. This was the malt kiln that we talked about recently as well. So he relied on that process to produce what ultimately remains the palest of all malts out there, Pilsner malt. And we're talking by pale, we're talking 1 to 2 degrees Lovibond is about where most Pilsner malts are going to fall in. And they accomplish this using various techniques. So let's get into a little bit about how Pilsner malt in general is made.
Yeah. So, Marshall, I'm curious, have you ever tried to make your own malt?
I have not. I actually had a buddy of mine, a buddy through the internet, it wasn't somebody who lives locally, who really got into the malting thing for a while. And it was such a pain in the ass for him to do that he stopped doing it pretty quickly. I think part of the problem is that in order to make a full batch, even a 5-gallon batch, you're looking at 10 to 12 pounds, for a 5% ABV beer, 10 to 12 pounds of malted grain. Well, that can be tough to manage. It's kind of cumbersome. And so he kind of got out of it, but he really did dig into the malting side of things. And I've had friends with craft maltsters or friends who are craft maltsters, and they've told me a lot about it. It's a fascinating process that, when you think about the science behind it, it's just really neat in my opinion.
Yeah, it's super cool, but man, what an incredible task to do. 10 pounds, is that your whole backyard of like the amount of space you need to grow it? I don't know. But so the simple process here, probably, glossing over a lot of nuances, is you grow the barley in the field and you cut it down. And then you need to take those barley kernels and you need to steep those in like water to reawaken the dormant grain. And so this is going to allow a germination phase to happen, where like a little sprout, it's like starts to grow within it, out of itself basically. And that actually opens up those starch reserves and ultimately activates the enzymes that are going to convert starches to sugars. So the next step in the process is kilning. And this is where the grains are heated up to specific temperatures, and it has two main purposes. We're going to halt the germination process there so that the seeds stop growing and leaving those starch reserves. But also, and this is incredibly important to Pilsner malt, is this is where the color and flavor development happens. So Pilsner malt is the touted to be the palest of all malts, like you said, Marshall, 1 to 2 Lovibond, due to being kilned at this relatively low temperature. And so my guess is that in the malting process, it's either in there for a shorter amount of time, or the temperature setting in which they use is the lowest in order to preserve that really pale color?
Yeah, so I actually did some poking around at different, obviously trade secrets for some of the bigger maltsters out there like Weirmann or Briess or Rar. I could not find anything on their precise process, the temperatures and the times and all of that stuff. But there's some great websites out there of homebrewers who, like I said, I had a buddy who did the same thing, got really into home malting and experimenting with it. And Pilsner malt, it seems the kind of the consensus is that it's a relatively low temperature, something like 122 Fahrenheit, if I recall correctly. I don't have that in my notes. Don't quote me on that. But then it can sit at that temperature, on a bed or something like that for upwards of 22 hours or something. So it's more of a low and slow thing. So you're not getting the heat to darken that grain too much. Just dry it out, halt that germination process so that you have access to what it is brewers are after, which is that starch in there, the energy that would otherwise be used by the barley kernel to grow another stalk of barley. And so that's kind of the simple way to think about the malting process. It's absolutely ingenious to me that folks hundreds and hundreds of years ago, maybe even thousands of years ago, came up with this process that we're able to kind of manipulate today to make one of our favorite drinks. Absolutely incredible. So when we think about the impact Pilsner malt, we're going to just isolate Pilsner malt today and talk about some generals of what we can expect from it. It does the same thing. You mash the malt. It tends to have a bit higher modification for whatever reason, meaning that it can self-convert really well. It can actually help other less modified malts to still make them convertible so that the sugars can be fermented by yeast later on down the line. But the main things that we're looking for with Pilsner malt are its impact on color and its impact on aroma and flavor. So in terms of color, if you make a 100%, let's just say 10 pounds, which is something like, what is, I don't even know what that is in kilograms, but a 10 pound, 5-gallon batch of Pilsner, all 100% Pilsner malt beer, you're going to end up with a beer that is very pale yellow, or what we often refer to as pale straw. This is that yellow color that's almost not yellow. It's kind of like a pastel yellow is what I've told people before. How would you describe the color of just straight Pilsner malt in a beer?
Well, I'm colorblind, so that's tough for me. But yellow, right? And so when you think about the kind of gradients there, you can kind of go up to like more orange or even like a Märzen, like amber, right? And so when you're just using 100% Pilsner malt, it can be like almost less than yellow, if that makes sense. Almost like kind of watery, like more transparent. It's kind of hard to describe, especially for a colorblind fellow like me.
Well, I'm sorry to put you on the spot there, Jordan. But I made a batch one time. I bought some, I forget what the source was, but it was not my typical, Briess, whatever, Pilsner malt. It was some random one that my local homebrew shop had in stock. I brought the whole sack home and I made this 100% Pilsner malt beer. And I remember serving it to a friend of mine, crystal clear. So, beers can look a little bit lighter if they're not totally clear just because of the reflection off of the particulates in that liquid. This beer was closer to color in water than it was to beer. It was so wild. And I believe it was 1.0 degree Lovibond Pilsner malt. So about as light as you're going to get. So that's one thing that I think that's part of the thing we go for, is we really like that lighter color. Now, when we look at comparisons between, domestic Pilsner malts and other malts that come from other regions, Pilsner malts, there is some variation. I've actually used Pilsner malts before that are up in around 2.2 to 2.5 degrees Lovibond, really pushing that almost pale malt thing. But, when people talk about the differences between Pilsner and pale malt, they're not that vast. The main thing, honestly, is just their level of kilning. And there's a lot of flavor development that comes from that, right? The darker you toast something, just imagine a piece of toast in your toaster. So these are the types of things that people discuss when they talk about using, regional malts or domestic malts. And I think it's uberly important to consider these things if you're trying to make the closest version possible to something as simple and delicate as a Czech Pale Lager, or any Czech lager for that matter. So let's talk a little bit about the differences that people, at least purported differences between Czech Pilsner Malt and domestic Pilsner Malt.
Sure. So I think on the top, they're grown in different continents, right? US or Canada versus Europe. And so even though they actually could be on very similar latitudinal lines, it's different dirt, different air, different maybe different sun exposure, different weather patterns. Apparently, like the sun exposure, like it's like atmospheric or concentration or whatever over New Zealand is credited to some of the flavors that they're getting in the New Zealand hops, right? So you can see how terroir is so much more than just dirt, but perhaps that does have an impact on the flavor of the barley plant. There's different varieties that could be grown. Like we said, there's different strain types. And really importantly is there could be different production methods in that there is a thought that traditional Czech malt is floor malted, whereas here in America, it's like mechanically kilned and malted, right? And so I don't know if you've ever seen photos of this, but it's really cool, these floor malting facilities. Like it's just this like massive, like, warehouse looking thing with just grain on the ground and dudes walking around with rakes, like raking it around. And it's like, it's got this such a like rustic vibe to it, and so it's really romantic. But people claim that production method, and maybe it's a gestalt, is like you like to say, with all these other varying factors, ultimately creates a product that's fundamentally different than domestic Pilsner malt. But there's a really important caveat I want to mention there, is that this whole idea that Czech malt is synonymous with floor malting is actually false. As of a year ago, the latest estimates that I've been able to find, only 4% of malted barley malt in the Czech Republic is floor malted. Huh. And Weyermann famously sells a floor malted Czech Pilsner malt, and it's actually grown and malted in Czechia. And so that is maybe their only product that's not made at their Bamberg facility. And so given how massive Weyermann is, it makes me wonder if the bulk of that 4% is in fact the Weyermann malt that's made there. So the Czech malt has this connotation with floor malting, but in fact in the modern era, that's just not realistically the case.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. And it makes perfect sense to me what you were saying, that if it's only 4%, give or take, of course, but if it's only about 4% of all of the Czech malt, Pilsner malt that we have access to is actually floor malted, it wouldn't surprise me if the vast majority, if not all, is coming from Weyermann, if they're the ones making it because of how big they are, how accessible their malts are to brewers. So that's really fascinating. Well, one of the things that's also associated with floor malting is lower modification malt. Modification is again, we're not going to dig into the science too much, but it's just a reference or kind of a measure of the conversion ability of the grain, of the ability for the enzymes to enzymatically convert those starches into fermentable sugar. And so with Czech Pilsner malt in general, or floor malted Czech malts, we should say, there is some, evidence, perhaps is the best word, that you're going to have to do something a little bit different to encourage the conversion of these less modified malts than you might with a hot or highly modified, domestic Pilsner malt. And that takes the form of, step mashes or decoction mashes, stuff like that. So those are commonly used methods when making these styles of beer, these Czech Pale Lagers. Now, when we talk about, the organoleptic differences between domestic and Czech Pilsner malt, what we're looking at, or what people seem to claim at least, is that Czech Pilsner malts have a richer, bready malt flavor that's a little bit more complex than, Canadian or US grown and malted Pilsner malts. And those are said to be a little bit softer with more of a subtly sweet maltiness to them, not as rich or complex. To me, those descriptions kind of go, if we're taking that linearly, and I'm saying, well, how do we apply a color rating to this? That more complex, rich, bready malt flavor to me is going to come out slightly darker than, say, a lighter, softer, subtly sweet malt that we might get from domestic maltsters here in town, or in this country. And so it's just kind of an interesting thing to consider for me, that maybe those European Pilsner malts are kilned a little bit darker than some of the Pilsner malts we have access to over here. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that there's a couple really important things that you put in there that's related to why this Czech Pilsner malt is supposed to be richer and breadier and more complex. And I think one is perhaps we're conflating the use of decoction. Czech lagers in the Czech Republic are basically exclusively decocted. It's like a rule for them over there. Just it's kind of like their Reinheitsgebot, right? The Czech purity law. It has to be decocted. And our latest decoction experiment that I brewed was significant. I couldn't believe it. And then in fact, we were able to detect a difference between a decocted Czech dark lager with a step mashed one. And so perhaps this richer flavor that we're associating with Czech Pilsner malt is actually a function of the mashing method. Who knows? But why do they do that mashing method? It's because they really like undermodified malts there. And when you read interviews with Czech brewers, they're like, we don't need to modify it because we decoct.
That's right.
And so it's all part of their gestalt. And but I was in researching for this episode, I found an interview with Weyermann where they were saying that their floor malted Pilsner malt is just as modified as their standard ones and does not need to be decocted. And in fact, if you compare the aroma wheels for the Czech floor malted malt by Weyermann and their Bavarian Pilsner malt by Weyermann, they're like identical. And so they even argue this really isn't that different. And so feel free to buy it and use it. But so I think that all of this exposes that there's a lot of like romanticism caught up in this stuff. And I mean, when we look at the analytics, like it's actually pretty modified.
Yeah.
Actually, you don't have to decoct it. And so it's like, ultimately, I think that really justifies an experiment to test this out. Does it actually taste any different, or is it just kind of in our heads?
Yeah, without a doubt. Now, since the focus of the experiment we're going to get to in the next segment was on Czech Pale Lager, just a little bit on that. The BJCP provides the following description for Czech Pale Lager. They say it's a lighter-bodied, rich, refreshing, hoppy, bitter pale Czech lager, having the familiar flavors of the stronger Czech Premium Pale Lager, but in a lower alcohol, lighter-bodied, and slightly less intense format. To me, that is exactly what I expect from Czech Pale Lager, also known as Bohemian Pilsner. Back in the day, that's what we used to call it, Bo Pils. And the traditional ingredients, as listed by the BJCP and every blog out there, is Czech Pilsner malt from traditional maltsters out in the Czech Republic or Czechia. Czech hops, which are usually going to be Saaz. Czech lager yeast, and then softer water. That's kind of what Pilsen is known for, is their very soft water that's low in sulfate and carbonate content. But you put those four ingredients together and you can make, your version of a Czech Pale Lager. But is it going to differ, using domestic versus an actual Czech malt? That's exactly what we aim to find out in an experiment that you performed a while back. Jordan, we're going to be getting into those results right after this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
With hundreds of doors across Houston, you can get expert care everywhere.
That's the difference between practicing medicine and leading it. Houston Methodist, leading medicine.
Plug in a Hyundai EV and the extraordinary happens. It's not just the ultra-fast charging capability and long range in the Ioniq 5 and Ioniq 6, or the adventure-seeking spirit of the Kona Electric, or the groundbreaking 601 horsepower Ioniq 5N. And it's not just the comfort in knowing that every Hyundai EV is backed by a 10-year, 100,000-mile limited electric battery warranty. Hyundai's EVs transform a low hum into a loud adventure. They bring color to your journey and turn energy into main character energy. So forget everything you thought you knew about EVs and turn the extraordinary into something truly electrifying. There's joy in every journey.
EPA estimated 303-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 5 SE SEL limited rear-wheel drive and 361-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 6 SE long-range rear-wheel drive with fully charged battery. Estimated range varies for other models and trims and depends on battery capacity, temperature options, and other factors. Limited battery warranty covers defects and materials for 10 years or 100,000 miles, whichever occurs first. See owner's manual for complete warranty details and limitations. Visit HyundaiUSA.com or call 562-314-4603 for more details.
From a superficial perspective, it makes sense that beers developed in a specific region would taste best, or at the very least different, if made with ingredients from the same region. However, I'm sure we've all had excellent examples of certain regional styles that were made with domestic ingredients, which in our case mean they're grown and malted in North America, typically Canada or the Midwest of the United States. I know for a fact that I have. We've got local breweries around here, Crow and Wolf, House of Pendragon, who are making excellent examples of, Czech Pale Lager, German Pilsner, and they might be using some traditional ingredients, but they're also using a lot of domestic stuff as well. So does it really matter where these ingredients are coming from? Jordan, you designed an experiment looking into the differences between Czech Pilsner Malt and a domestic Pilsner Malt when when brewing a Czech Pale Lager.
Right. So maybe we can dive into the recipe and the process here before we get into the results. So for those that have not been to the Czech Republic or not super familiar with Czech lagers, they're often in the Czech Republic differentiated by their strength, specifically their starting gravity. And one thing that you don't see very often here in the States is a Czech 10 Plato Pale Lager. So that's, that's when the beer's original gravity is 10 Plato. That's about 1040 OG. And that's what I did here. So I thought that'd be a really nice low strength malt forward lager with nothing to hide behind. So let's see if we can actually taste a difference here. So for the malts, which is really the core of this beer and the core of this experiment, I used either 100% Czech Pilsner Malt. Then that was made by Sledavny Soufflé. And that was sourced and supplied by my wonderful local malt sponsor here in Portland, Oregon, FH Steinbart. They really pride themselves on the variety of interesting craft and European malts that they're able to source. And so I collaborated with them on this experiment, and they actually were able to find me some interesting Czech malt that wasn't the standard Weyermann floor malted bow pills, which a lot of us might be more familiar with.
Yeah.
For the comparison malt that we selected, we chose Great Western's Idaho Pilsner Malt. I love that malt. It's a fantastic European-ish style Pilsner malt. It's grown just one state away from me, and I really like that malt as kind of a quasi-European analog or a substitute, because there's really significant, I think, sustainability benefits from using a local malt. And if it can taste really similar to a European variety, but I don't have to ship it across the sea, why not? And so that's why we chose this, is we thought, let's choose a malt that's known for having a kind of European style vibe and see if we can actually taste the difference between the two.
Yeah, I think going with Great Western Idaho Pils is a perfect example to compare it to. First off, it is domestic. It's made right here in Idaho of the United States. And I too have had wonderful, wonderful experiences with that malt. I absolutely love it. Now, when you were weighing these out and preparing these grains, did you notice a difference just in the way they looked or smelt, or did you taste any? I'm curious what your thoughts were before even making the beer.
It's funny. Whenever I'm preparing for these experiments and taking photos, my first photo is typically the grain mill, right? And when I weighed these out, I weighed them out side by side, I think the night before, and then put them in identical boxes so they would be ready for the next morning. I noticed just visually, wow, these look totally different. So if you go to the article, we posted side by side photos, and you can see that Czech malt is darker than that domestic one.
Yeah, I'm looking at the photo right now, and it's not huge. It's noticeable though. And to me, again, that kind of validates this idea that, one, obviously the malting process, the kilning process, all of that is going to be a little bit different. That perhaps though, at least the maltster that you got that Czech Pale Malt from, or Czech Pilsner Malt from, may have kilned it at least slightly longer than the Great Western did their Idaho Pils, which arguably is known for being very, very pale. So just an interesting pre-observation prior to you brewing these beers, which we can talk about now.
Totally. And I guess another important thing to mention is this Sledovny, it's so hard to say, Sledovny souffle malt is not floor malted, as far as I can tell. I found an article talking about it, and it appears to be, in the 96% of Czech malts that are not floor malted. So ostensibly, these had similar kilning methods, and we see a difference in the visual differences before they're actually mashed. So getting into the mash, I like to do step mashes on my lager beers. I kind of have a house mash recipe, which is looking at a 144F or 62C rest. And then I do that for like 45 minutes, an hour, and then go up to 160F or 71C, and then hold that for another half hour, 45 minutes or so, and then up to 170F or 77C for a mash out. And I'm using the claw hammer units, so that's kind of brew in a basket. So then you pull that out and let the sweet wort drip down. And so, ostensibly for a Czech lager using Czech Pilsner malt, you need to do a step mash if you want to get good efficiency because of the risk of undermodification. So it will be really interesting to see by the end of the boil if we have different OGs. So we boiled that wort for 75 minutes, classic Czech lager, so Sots all the way. We got 28 grams at 75 minutes, 28 grams of Sots at 30, and then 57 grams at the final 15 minutes of the boil. So after that boil is finished, we chill them down and get them into fermenters to continue chilling down to my target pitching temp because I just can't get it all the way down with a chiller, even in the winter here in Oregon. And ultimately, prior to pitching any yeast, we're looking at 1041 OG identical between the two. And that's exactly what we're going for with that 10 Plato lager.
Yeah, that 10 Plato is 1040 OG, so 1041 you're smack on, which just I think goes to show that Brewfather does a pretty good job with the predictions there. But man, the fact that both of them were exactly the same, and I'm looking at the photo right now of your refractometer readings, and they are, they're about as close to identical as you can get for two beers that were brewed completely separately. So at this point, yeah, maybe the malts looked a little bit different, but their modification, the conversion of those starches into fermentable sugars, we're looking like things are moving around the same pace at this point, at least. And
I gotta wonder if we would have seen different OGs if I had done a single infusion mash.
I wondered the same thing. Yeah, that's fascinating. I thought the same thing because of the fact that that the both of them going under the step mash that you used, you are really kind of leaning into the most conversion possible, right? Regardless of their modification.
Exactly. So far, similar. After I got those down to my desired temperature, 49F or 9C in my fermentation chamber, I pitched a large starter of Imperial Yeast L28 Urkel, which was decanted and split evenly in half. That was, collectively calculated to be a desired lager type pitching rate. It's off to the races. So fermenting cold. And after a week of fermentation, I transitioned to spunding step to continue the final gravity points of attenuation at a higher temperature of like 62F or 17C to finish out the fermentation, reduce and get rid of that diacetyl and also naturally carbonate the beer in place.
Yeah. And so, this is a pretty, I think, common approach, at least for modern, brewers of Czech Pale Lager, is that, they start it nice and cool after about a week to ensure that no off flavors are developed during that lag and early fermentation phase. They move to spunding valves to capture that CO2. Natural carbonation is a common thing for this style, but then gently ramp the temperature up a little bit, again, for a diacetyl rest, just to ensure complete attenuation and that there's no buttery ickiness in that beer. So sounds like a normal process to me.
Right. So we started at the same OG. Well, where'd we finish? And we're finally seeing a observable difference in the brewing, outcome, in that we see the Czech Pilsner Malt as a finishing gravity of 1010, and the domestic Pilsner Malt, Great Western Idaho Pils, 1008. And so, maybe if we repeated these trials 100 times, we would see some variations in either direction, and ultimately it would just be noise. But in this one example, it's providing some anecdotal evidence that the Czech Pilsner Malt is a little less modified, and that even though we're able to eke out the same OG, it's just not going to attenuate as well as this really high attenuation domestic Pilsner malt by Great Western.
Yeah, we're not going to sit here and say that this is purely a function of the variable, though, given how tight, your controls are in brewing these, and we're all very, very nerdy brewers here. It does seem like this may very well be due to the malt used for each of these batches, and that's fine. Now, 2 specific gravity points. It's not nothing, but it's also not that big of a deal. Chances are nobody's going to be able to taste the difference based on that piece of it alone. So just something I think interesting to put a pin in and kind of think about as we continue discussing this experiment.
Yeah, and it really demonstrates something that you would expect, that a under-modified Czech Pilsner malt would attenuate a little less.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
People taste the difference. Let's find out. So then I start to slow ramp those beers down to 32F or 0C over the course of a few days. I like to do like 3 degrees in the morning lower and then 3 degrees in the evening. I actually heard that from Jamil on a podcast when he was pro brewing. And I just really like to, gradually reduce that temperature because I don't want to risk shocking the yeast or prevent like any sort of cleanup that's happening during that phase. Martin has a really interesting video with John Palmer on our YouTube show where they actually can show that there may be some sort of foam implications with a crash cool. That gradual step actually helps preserve head formation and retention. And as you know, in Czech lager, that's really important. You want the biggest head you could possibly get. Anecdotally, I will add that I have a Lucre faucet, the side pull. That also really helps if you wanted those really authentic Czech pours. So once we're cold, we're lagering for 4 weeks in a traditional method and just trying to get that clear and free of any sulfur or any sort of off flavors that might still be present. And after that lager pairing, it's time for evaluation.
Now, one of the things you did in this batch that you don't always do, but I'm fully on board with it, is that you find both of these beers with gelatin. I don't think that is... We're very confident. We've done so many gelatin experiments. In fact, we've done so many already that it's hard for us to come up with new experiments to test it out. I don't think any of them have come back significant, which only seems, it indicates that the fear people have of finding with gelatin outside of, vegetarians and vegans, we understand they're not going to use it for I think moral reasons. Whereas for us, there's a lot of talk in brewing that, if you find your beer, if you filter your beer in any way whatsoever, whether chemically or mechanically, it's going to deplete hop flavor and it's going to have it. We have found over and over and over again that just does not seem to be the case. So I actually like the fact that you find with gelatin. I don't know. What were your thoughts in going in on this? It sounds like, I would imagine you kind of agree with me that it's not going to have a deleterious effect on the, flavor and aroma profile of the beers.
Yeah, no way. And, we want clear lager, right? And if anything, maybe a cloudy lager would, cloud up your ability to tell the difference. So maybe there's an argument for fining, right? So, if you're going to go a more traditional route, you're going to lager a lot longer in order to get that clear beer. And so that's, like you've said previously, powdered time, right? And there's multiple ways to skin the cat, and that's how we did it this time.
Yeah, like I said, I'm fully on board. I just don't want to leave anything out for our listeners who maybe haven't read the article yet, or who plan to go read it and see that and go, wait a minute, this is the reason for the results. No, I really don't think so. Go back and read some other gelatin experiments. Now, I'm looking at a picture of both of these beers side by side. The photo that you took, obviously, our eyes in real life are going to see things a little bit differently than an iPhone can capture. So we get that. But to my eyes, these beers look similar in most characteristics in terms of like clarity and foam quality. It looks like one maybe has a little bit better foam quality, but I imagine that was poured later. It's not that big of a difference. The one thing that is different, as people might be guessing based on our earlier observations of the malts, is that the Czech malt beer is slightly darker yellow than the domestic malt one. Again, it's not crazy different, but even I can see it through the photograph that you took. And I'm curious what your perception of those were as you were, looking at them in real life.
Yeah, the Czech malt looked more yellow, and whereas the Idaho Pils was more like off, like light yellow, like that watery kind of thing we talked about on the front end. And so it was just, to use a beer term, paler. and that the Czech malt produced a more of like almost golden type color. And in my opinion, the Czech malt had a more authentic look in terms of the color you would expect for an authentic Czech lager. By no means was the Idaho Pils like gross looking or like, you know, something we want to dump the whole batch based on the look, but it almost had more of like a Japanese rice lager type of like thin yellow look, whereas the Czech malt one was more like full, approaching golden, perhaps.
Yeah, so I was in summer of 2023, so last year, my family took a really fun trip to Europe where we hit a couple different cities, and one of the cities we went to was Prague in the Czech Republic, and obviously I drank heaps and heaps of Pilsner Urquell, which over there it's always fresh. I mean, it's so phenomenally good over there. One of the things that I noticed, and I've drank out of the bottle and off tap, here in the United States as well, same experience, but it is a darker Pilsner beer. It's not that pale straw. I would say that it is qualifiably yellow. It's just a yellow Pilsner beer, slightly darker than say like a Miller Lite, which does border more on that pale straw, in my opinion, which I think is very interesting and likely is, at least in my mind, I always correlated that with the malt that they're using and that they do things a little bit differently. So again, just an initial observation of the beer prior to sampling it or anything like that. Now, one of the things we do with every experiment is the brewer of that experiment does their own series of what we call semi-blind triangle tests. We tend to do about 5, attempts at this with somebody else serving us beers in different ratios of, what's the odd beer out and what 2 are the same. Now, you did 5 of these, and I'm curious, out of those 5, how many times were you able to accurately identify the unique sample?
So, I like to do a side-by-side to kind of like train my palate. Sometimes some variables it's going to be super obvious, like that hop water experiment we referenced earlier in the episode where one was horribly oxidized. You could tell the difference from the other room.
Yeah.
And so these, side by side, I'm like, wow, okay, these are really similar. And they were awesome Czech 10 Plato lagers, by the way. But the Czech one felt a little more complex, just a little bit more. But when I go blind, I just could not tell the difference. I got 1 of 5 right.
Yeah, that's of all people, I would have expected you, the person who not only designed the experiment, brewed the beers, but had them on tap and was drinking them prior to even trying your own triangle test. I would expect you to be able to pick out the unique sample or the odd beer out, but you couldn't do that. And does that give us a little bit of a peek into how our blind tasters did? Well, you served this triangle test to 27 different tasters, none of whom were aware of the variable at all. And that's what we do. This is a blind data collection. Out of the 27 people who did this, 14 would have had to identify the odd beer out in order for us to say with any level of confidence that it does seem like the base malt used or the region from which that Pilsner malt was from did have a perceptible impact. Out of those 27, how many actually ended up picking the odd beer out?
Only 11, which is about 41% of participants, which in the test that we run is not significant, indicating that testers could not reliably tell 2 beers apart where one was made with Czech malt and the other was made with domestic.
Fascinating result. I did not expect this. I will say we've done some other grain comparison experiments that have had equally as mind-boggling results. I think we did a Pilsner and a pale malt comparison that was non-significant. This one, though, for some reason, I think it's the belief that so many brewers have that Czech Pilsner malt is, a premium malt, that it's going to impart these different flavors and flavor characteristics, but also the fact they looked different, the beers looked different. I would have expected them to taste and smell a little bit different as well. And in this case, it just didn't seem to be the case. Do you have any caveats that you think is there something you did that may have contributed to these beers being more similar? I'm looking at the design of it thinking I would have expected these to taste different based exactly on everything that you did. But do you have any ideas as to what may have contributed to the similarity of these beers? Or
well, earlier you were talking about the color of the Czech lagers that you had in the Czech Republic, and you were attributing it to the malt choice, and that's got to be partly true. But the other big part of this is decoction. Those beers are decocted over there, and that's going to give you some of that gold color effect due to, concentration, perhaps Maillard reactions, et cetera, et cetera. And these beers notably were step mashed. They were not decocted. So maybe we would have been able to tell a difference if they were both decocted and using that Czech Pale Malt as it's ostensibly intended to be used. But I think I was surprised. I really expected this to make a difference. You know me, I'm all about, using traditional ingredients and traditional styles, and very dogmatic about using German malts and German hops and German yeast and German beers and vice versa for Czech beers. I will say that I will use Weyermann malts in my IPAs because that's just kind of my house malt and it works great. But I think for these Euro styles, I've really bought into this dogma that you got to use the traditional ingredients. And given that Idaho Pils is explicitly intended to be a domestic substitute for European varieties, instead of being like bummed, I was actually really inspired and really happy that we're able to make such a authentic malt stateside.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. And that's just one of the domestic maltsters that we have access to. I've used Rar Pilsner Malt. I've used Mecca Great Estates. I think it's Pelton is their Pilsner Malt. All of it is fantastic. I've definitely had Pilsner malts that I think taste different. For example, Weyermann's Barca Malt, their Pilsner Malt, I think has a unique, almost like grape skin flavor to it that is how I describe it, but it's still very good. Would we have been able to taste a difference if we had used, the Barca Malt to the Soufflé Malt? Who knows? But in this case, I think there's some element of like, we can breathe out. If I've been using Great Western to make these quote classic, traditional Czech Pale Lagers and they're coming out good, but are they as good, as they could have been? These results suggest that maybe they're pretty close. They're close enough to being as equally as good, and I just think that's kind of a cool thing. Now, we did get some comments on this one from all around of our social medias, the article, all of that stuff. So we're going to start with one from Daniel, who is actually from Bavaria, Germany. He says, very interesting experiment. I appreciate that you brewed a straight 10 Plato Svetla Pivo with no shenanigans. I've been trying unsuccessfully to source any Czech malt. It's surprisingly difficult considering I live not too far away. I'm also not convinced the grain itself is radically different from the stuff that grows over here. He's referring to Bavaria, but malting techniques might differ. What do you think about that, Jordan?
Well, yeah, that's literally what Weyermann said in that article that I was referencing earlier, is that they're claiming that the Czech floor malted Pilsner malt that they make is very similar to the Bavarian traditionally malted malt that they sell. And when you look at the aroma wheels, they're like identical. So I think that he can probably rest assured just use whatever Bavarian malt he can access. And as long as you're using Czech hops and perhaps Czech yeast, you can make a Czech lager with German malt.
Well, yeah, and you consider the history of Pilsner malt in general. Bavaria is not far from Pilsen at all, particularly considering how far we are from both, from Europe in general. Chances are that they were borrowing each other's techniques and methods as they were developing their malting process. So I can't imagine they're too different as well. Thanks for the comment, Daniel. Next comment comes from Bonehead Brewery, who he left this on our Facebook post. He said, I have a bag of that malt, the Sladovny Soufflé, and found if you use it 50-50 with pale malt, it makes a lovely American pale ale. That does not surprise me in the slightest. In fact, I found myself relying much more heavily on Pilsner malt for all of my American style hoppy ales, just because I like how pale it is. What about you, Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, you got to take a step into my home brewery recently, and I'm using lager yeast and German lager yeast and German malt for all my IPAs at this point. So we're really breaking down international boundaries in this kind of modern hoppy brewing world. I think all bets are off at this point.
Yeah, and just for everyone out there, if you're like, oh, this guy's a crazy, for using Pilsner malt and Pilsner yeast for his hoppy beers, they're some of the best hoppy homebrewed beers I've ever had. So I've done it as well. I love it. I'm a big fan of just using L13 Global. That's the Weinstefan lager strain for hoppy pale ale and IPA. It's phenomenally clean and just so good, and very well attenuates really well too. So final comment comes from Jake Sakoti, I believe is how you say it, Sakati, on Instagram. He says, I just made a Czech lager with a local brewery for my wedding, almost 100% Maine grown Pilsner malt. And I'd agree, it seemed like a fine example of the style.
This style is really amalgamation or a culmination of various ingredients, right? Because if we swapped out the Czech malt with German malt on its own, sure, it's still a Czech Pale Lager. But if you use all German hops, I mean, that's really the difference, right? Satz tastes a little different than Hallertau Mittelfrüh, right? And so I think that as long as you can get at least the hops right, you're there at this point.
Yeah, another thing to consider, if we're just talking about, the styles, if you take I believe we actually did a water profile experiment on in essence, a Czech Pale Lager, but one where the water was built up with higher sulfate and carbonate content to more closely resemble what you might find in Bavaria. And it was, I could be wrong, but if I recall correctly, it was a significant experiment, as many of our water chemistry experiments have been. That to me is almost more the defining factor. Yeah, Czech Satz is going to have, just saying Czech Satz, I can smell and almost taste it in my mouth. It has a very unique, identifiable, flavor and aroma profile to it. You use something like Tettninger or something, you could probably fool some people, but to me, what really defines a Czech Pale Lager and a lot of Czech Pilsners and lagers in general is the water profile, is that soft, round. It's not terribly sharp, but it's still clean. It really kind of creates this blank palette for the malt and the hops to really shine. Whereas, a nice German Pilsner is going to have a little bit more of that crispy characteristic to it. At least that's my belief and my experience. And it's been somewhat backed up by some data out there. But in this case, the fact that a domestic Pilsner malt was indistinguishable by both you and a set of blind tasters from a beer that was made, the same exact beer that was made with a Czech, Pilsner malt, I just think is fascinating. So that is all the time we've got for this episode. Do you have any final comments, Jordan?
No, I'm just really excited for Czech beer, and I can't wait to brew my next one.
One of my absolute favorite styles of all time, Czech Pale Lager. I'm going to go try to find some today because I'm going out with some friends later. So don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Cade takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss the fascinating research they're doing on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
It's better over here. After investing billions to light up our network, T-Mobile is America's largest 5G network. Plus, right now, you can switch, keep your phone, and we'll pay it off up to $800. See how you can save on every plan versus Verizon and AT&T at T-Mobile.com/across America.
Up to 4 lines via virtual prepaid card. Allow 15 days. Qualifying unlocked device credit service ported 90+ days with device and eligible carrier and timely redemption required. Card has no cash access and expires in 6 months.